Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the 9th annual Laurentian Bank Institutional Investor Series. Just to recall, my name is Noban Sethi. I'm the Diversified Industries Analyst here at Laurentian Bank. With me is Jordan Simon. He's helping me moderate this session. Before we start the conversation, just some housekeeping items. Please ensure your microphone is on mute and your camera is turned off during the presentation. Please ensure your name appears on the screen so we can promptly address any questions that you may have. We'll take some question and answers at the end of the sessions, but please feel free to ask any questions in the chat session as well. Jordan will help me sort of pick those questions and ask our panelists. We have a very good, and I think this is going to be a very informative session with NFI Group. We have with us Paul Sobry, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer at New Flyer Group. It's one of the leading independent bus manufacturers. I think investors are well aware of this company. I always think that if you have taken a public transit in the North American market, probably it's going to be one of those buses that's been manufactured from NFI Group. Paul has been with the firm as president and CEO since January 2009. Prior to that, he was with Standard Aero for over 2 decades in a variety of roles, with president in 2001. So he has that leadership experience and he's been navigating the growth for New Flyer as well. So welcome, Paul. We really appreciate that you took out time. I know it's been an extremely busy time for you, so we really appreciate that you're here to speak with our investor community.
Thanks, Noah.
So let's start with our session. And the first question that I think will be probably at the end, at the top of everyone's mind, that's supply chain issues. Have they improved? Recent results from OEMs have been really mixed. Some have shown some sort of improvements. Some are still struggling. So how is it looking at NFI Group?
Well, look, thanks for the opportunity and thanks, for the question. I think it's the most appropriate one for us right now. Just a little context, COVID has not been kind to us in our industry. First of all, our customers went through hell all the way back to March of 2020 and continue to have, serious issues with driver challenges and absenteeism and ridership and all those other stuff. The impact on us originally was more around stability of order book and our ability to execute on our factories and our orders. We really haven't had cancellations of orders, but we've definitely had delays of orders. And so that then translates into last year. We started off last year and I'm actually a pretty good place. We had a good first quarter. And I think in our business now, we're up to over 2,000 positive COVID cases. So quite a dramatic impact on our own attendance and our own absenteeism and the ability to efficiently run product lines. But it really was August and September of last year where we started to see, let's call it crippling issues associated with supply chain. So prior to that, we were running a business where for the most part, it's point of use inventory. We'd have 7 to 10 days of inventory. We don't have central warehouses of stockpiles of parts. And the other dynamic is every single customer's bus is different. And that's hard for some people to get their heads around. And I don't mean choices of a painted mirror versus a chrome mirror. I mean fundamentally different buses, everything from floor thickness to window tints to structure and layout of the bus to camera systems and so forth. And so, we're more akin to a highly engineered custom ordered job shop than we are production lines, even though we build them on production lines. So with that, the stage set, we started to see crippling issues in the fourth quarter of last year. The ability that forced us actually, hey, you cannot run the production line anymore because you can't have you can't put a seat in a bus unless you got the floor in the bus. If you don't have the floor, you've got cascading issues. We also quickly realized for every 1 hour on the production line that we miss, you and I working in a cell gnome to put on something, if we don't do it in station, we've got 3 or 4 hours downstream of rectification work. And so there's a bit of a catch-22 in there. You can continue to try and run your lines and make up downstream or offline at the end, or you slow down your line rates, which is what we kind of did both of them. So bring us to fast forward to today, to say, has our supply chain issues been resolved? The answer is absolutely not. Some parts have gotten better and some parts have gotten worse, quite honestly. Anything with a microchip in it continues to be a real problem. And then compare and contrast a little bit an automotive manufacturer that themselves would buy a computer chip or a part. We don't buy that kind of stuff. We buy an end item for an axle, an engine, a DEF tank with a sensor on it from a supplier, and then we embed it in our product. So we've continued to kind of keep our run rates low or slower. We've started to build backlog again, which is a really positive outlook for us in terms of the next chapter in the future of our business. You can't ship a bus without all of the parts. So even though some parts have got a little bit better, you're still in this dynamic that you can't finish the bus. Of course, you've seen this, Norman, but in our world, inspectors from a customer online watching us build the bus. We have inspectors at the end of our lines inspecting the bus before we ship it. And then you have customer inspectors once the bus gets to the customer. And so you have those complexities of, as you change your schedule, as you push pull, as you do or don't have parts, the ability of the inspectors to inspect the bus and so on and so forth. So long answer to a short question. We guided last year, changed our guidance in the September and October, I don't remember the exact date, and said that, look, we're going to have a really tough fourth quarter. And quite honestly, the first half of this year, we think is going to be rough. And we're still in that mode. We haven't been idling our plants this year. We're still running at a lower rate, which we did idle last year. We continue to play, we joke about the game whack-a-mole, where you're continuing to try and solve problems as opposed to really focused on efficiency building product. We've seen it. It's continuing this year. Some parts are better. Just to give you some color, anything with a microchip's been a problem. Anything that has to do with resins, so fiberglass manufacture and so forth, has been a problem. Lots of things associated with electronics like connectors and certain things to build wiring harnesses have been a problem. Extrusions, aluminum extrusions and so forth. Glass in some cases has been a problem. And again, it's not like it's always the same window on the same bus. There's thicknesses, there's tints, there's grades, and all those things. Those things continue to plague us, which is why we guided and talked about first half of this year being slow and some kind of confident recovery as we move through the second half and into next year.
That's wonderful color. And just what sort of gives you confidence on that second half? Like, is it the communication that you're having with some of the partners that's saying, second half probably it's going to look better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a little bit like we're banking on suppliers' revised forecast of dates of parts and so forth. It's a little bit of a catch-22 where we've effectively hedged some of what we're hearing from suppliers in terms of dates of parts, because the downside, if we're wrong and we start up production lines at certain rates or keep them at higher rates, all we're going to do is build work in process, which sucks up working capital and then requires extra labor downstream to try and fix those buses. So we've got a very sophisticated supply chain and sourcing team. Again, we're building a very complex product. So we have, lots of people spending their time working with suppliers to try and gauge our confidence in what they can supply and when they'll be able to supply it, and therefore us be able to operate efficient production lines without low, labor efficiency or productivity, and also without crazy overtime to try and to make it up. So, that it continues to be tough. It's a little bit better in some cases. We're isolated on certain product, like, pick one, anything with a DEF tank. We've got concerns about how health that will get in the second half of the year, or battery supply from our primary battery supplier, the pace at which they're going to be able to provide those batteries, those kinds of things. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. May it happen a little bit earlier or have more confidence earlier? That's a possibility. But given our history over the last, let's call it 12 months on real frustration of supply chain, we've tried to be prudent in the way we're trying to run our factories and the rates we're going to run at.
Okay, that's fair. And just, you've mentioned that absenteeism or, workforce because of Omicron problems. So that really not impacted your production because you were already running at a lower capacity then?
Well, yes and no, right? These are very close quarters, right? These people are working on production lines, and you and I and Stephen are in a cell putting wheels on a bus, and if you test positive, the impact on you having to go off, but also us having to go off in isolation continues. We have lowered our rate. We've tried to spread out some of those manufacturing functions. We've tried to, build a fixture that's got plexiglass in the middle, so you and I can load a wheel without having, direct close contact and all those things. Absenteeism continues to be at an escalated level for both people that have COVID, people that are isolating, but also we still have families that have issues, with taking care of elderly people or homeschooling kids or all those other issues that contribute to that stuff. So while every one of us is encouraged by, vaccinations and by getting closer to something that's reasonable herd immunity and the relief, if you will, of the restrictions by the government, whether it's schooling or whether it's access to home cares or whatever, all that stuff is playing into this thing. But again, that all played into our desire or our decision, if you will, to lower our run rate. And then on the way back up, as we've got to pick up that lost absenteeism and be that much more productive. And then we know in some cases to get back to previous production levels, we're going to have to add people. And as we all know, that's not an easy dynamic in today's environment as well. So, I'm not trying to be doomsday. I'm trying to be honest that we've tried to include all that stuff in the pace at which we want to and feel we can recover. The good news in all that is that our order book that comes out of last year, and when we release our results, you'll see some really encouraging, and you've seen it in the last couple of days, Nolan, in terms of press releases, key customers.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And I think one of the competitive advantage that New Flyer has is that you have a broad range of products, and then you're platform agnostic as well. So I'm just wondering if that sort of helps you when you quickly want to ramp it up, because you can manufacturing depending on how your backlog looks like. So if, let's say, supply chain for one segment improves, you can quickly move that line. If any color on that would be great.
Well, you bring up a really good point. Fundamental to our strategy is we're not just an ICE propulsion or internal combustion bus supplier. We're not just a battery bus supplier or a fuel cell bus supplier. We've chosen to build factories that can build any product on the same line. We've chosen to design and build buses that have variation of propulsion, but be based on the same structural product and the same, effectively, glider, as we would call it. That's the really good news, is that depending on the pace of adoption of zero emission, based on the strategy each transit agencies for whether they're going to buy more diesels or more hybrids or more natural gas as they think about moving and changing their fleets over time. We believe it's not if, that ultimately, and it's going to take 15 years plus or minus so before we completely are out of zero emission in our world, out of ICE combustions in our world. But the pace of adoption, we think we can adapt depending on what people order and what they want. And it's really hard for a customer. It was easy. No, it wasn't easy. It was easier for a customer to say, I'll try, I got a fleet of 500 buses and I'll try 10 electrics and I'll, to a pilot project on the side. When it becomes 5%, 10%, 20 or 50% of their fleet, they've now got to run different charging versus fueling strategies, different maintenance cadence and strategies and so forth. They got to multitask and train their workforce. They got to figure out how to get the energy and the charging infrastructure, which means their depot has to be really thought through. So that agnostic product, an agnostic manufacturing strategy, I think bodes well for us. It has proven to bode well. The orders that we've been winning, and again, we've seen some of the other day, some of them are for more zero emissions, some of them are for conventional buses. And some of our newer competitors don't have that ability to offer. In the meantime, ultimately, sure, it'll be zero emission. In the meantime, there's mixed fleets.
And in our coach business, I know we've been encouraged. We manufacture our new model public and private coaches on the same production line. And so we ceased production of the private coaches during the pandemic because that market was the hardest hit, tour and charter, travel, those types of things. We sold out of the inventory we had that we built in 2019. We sold out of that, in 2020, sold out of that inventory in 2021. And now we've resumed production of those private motor coaches on that same common line. So to your point, Naman, by being propulsion agnostic, by having common production lines, it is easier when we resume things to kind of start to ramp back up. Now, as Paul mentioned, getting labor and ramping things back up takes time. But we were pleased to see where the private market finished last year and how it started this year.
Okay, that's wonderful color. I think one point that I want to touch here is there's a lot of new EVs coming in the market. There's a lot of noise of new specialized OEMs coming in within the EV sector. But if you could just talk about your end market, which is transit agencies, and how sort of relationships that you have with them. I assume it takes a lot of time to build those relationships, to understand their demand, or to put it this way, it's not an off-the-shelf product. These transit agencies have a lot of requirements. So just merely having an EV is not that easy to win those transit contracts, right?
Well, I think you bring up a good point. First of all, the dynamic of customization is driven partly because it's a civic responsibility, or in some cases, the states or the provinces have funding responsibility. And so the local dynamic, the local operating environment, the local union or special interest groups priorities and so forth causes a high degree of customization. And I always pick one, put a Calgary and an Edmonton bus side by side. Those things both have wheels and steering wheels, but they are very different vehicles. Everything's structure, seat layout, electronics, cameras, driver pod, and so on and so forth. And so that whole dynamic around trying to understand what a customer wants. An RFP from a customer doesn't say 40-foot buses, what's your price? It tells us lots of the ingredients. I want so-and-so's air conditioner and so-and-so's axle, and I want this camera from that guy and so forth. Some of them are a little bit more generic. I want a camera system that can do this, but most of them tell us a lot of those ingredients. So understanding the customer's history of why that stuff is in there based on their purchasing history in the past, or based on their operating dynamic of them trying to get fleet commonality with a new bus and an old fleet, in addition to the fact that we're in every one of those places with service people today, or parts support, or we've helped do engineering studies with those customers, really helps us understand and how to respond to an RFP, as opposed to, do you like my zero emission bus and how many do you want? When it comes to the SPAC dynamic and new EVs in our space, there really isn't that many. We have the conventional competitors. Let's just focus on transit for a sec. We've have ourselves and a Volvo-owned company in Quebec called Nova, and another U.S. private owned called Gillig, and a small business that sits within the Rev Group. Then there's the Proteras that have been around for, believe it or not, I think it's 18 years now, that has 600 or 700 buses on the road. The only other real new guy is this Arrival that has shown up, and it came through a SPAC. Yes, we have some of these other guys like XL Fleet and others that maybe play in some of our smaller business that Arbach has, but we don't have lots of new guys. We fundamentally believe customer choice and customization is going to continue because of all those things we talked about earlier: local dynamics, local funding, local pressures. We also fundamentally believe that evolution from ICE to zero emission is going to happen, which means we believe that anything we can tie our next generation vehicles back to the current fleet they have, whether it's train parts or software logic or all these other things, bodes well for our competitiveness, because a transit agency is a very complex operation, lots of political oversight, lots of special interest groups, and it's a really tough job to execute. So if we can make that easier or be less complex, that's been the charge of our strategy. The last thing is, we've chosen to be a big service provider. We got a big distributed service network. In some cases, like in our private motor coach world, we do service for customers, but we also have tied our parts and our manuals and our training integral to our bus offering. And as a transit agencies, they see that as a very comprehensive type solution to help them operate the fleet.
Okay, that's good. And just one thing that I sort of want to understand your thought process within this electric buses or EV expansion that you're doing. You're doing a lot of partnerships as well, like for instance, the batteries that go into your buses. For that matter, even in Alexander Dennis, I think you've partnered with BYD as well. So what's the thought process of partnering with some of these new technology players and not doing those things in-house with some of the other players are doing?
I really think that's a great question. If we were a massive automotive company that had huge repeatable volume and the ability to standardize, it's one thing to say, we'll own, take the battery dynamic. We'll buy directly from a cell provider. We'll package the battery. We'll then build it into a battery pack and so forth. We're at the early stage of this adoption of zero emission buses. Technology, software, battery capability, electric motor evolution and so forth continues to change very fast. So, compare and contrast a little bit are a completely different business, the school bus business. Lion Bus has chosen to spend $100 million to set up a battery packaging facility to buy, I guess LG Chem or whoever sells to do all that stuff. And they've chosen to try and put it in school buses and trucks and to try and sell to other people. Well, we've chosen to be a bus and coach expert and specialist. And we've chosen to choose strategic partners to help us evolve that so that we're not spending 100 million. What if the game changes? What if solid state batteries comes in? What if another battery supply challenge happens and it's not LG or a Samsung or whatever? Our strategy has to try and be, at this point in our evolution, smart integrators and partners, as opposed to a full bet on that being the only game or one part of that game. And so, I mean, hell, our strategy on batteries for our zero emission buses has changed so fast and evolved so fast in the last 3 or 4 years. Boy, if we would have set up our own battery factory 3 or 4 years ago, we'd be, well, I was gonna say screwed. We'd be in real trouble right now. So I'm not diminishing what Lion has chosen to do or what Proterra is choosing to do. Because of this customized nature, because of the early stage of this evolution, because of the pace at which the thing's going to change, we believe that being smart integrators and smart buyers allows us to take advantage of technological changes faster, but also take advantage of cost changes. You know, the cost of an electric cell is whatever, 80% cheaper today than it was 4 or 5 years ago. That will change too. And as smart buyers, we then have the ability to pivot technically, but also apply purchasing pressure as opposed to, uh-oh, I'm married approach.
Okay, that's good. And I think you've mentioned this earlier that you've won some recent contracts, which actually you've made announcement of those as well. And we've seen that U.S. infrastructure bill has some announcements around electric buses and charging infrastructure. Can you speak how those and how that will benefit New Flyer?
I'll tee it up, and then Stephen's far closer to the details than I. But here's the elevator speech to start. First of all, the Canadian government historically never funded buses for our communities in Canada. That was a city fund with provincial money. And in the last year or two, the Canadian government has stepped up and changed their programs and made a commitment to help fund buses and infrastructure. So we have a source of funding and a multi-year approach that we never had in Canada. In the UK, you have private operators that bid on routes, win them, and then operate public transit for the private people, but they're private businesses. And so government funding to help them transition their fleets is a positive. There's all kinds of timing and gymnastics and so forth, but net, it's a positive. In the United States, we saw a change in the government to President Biden and Vice President Harris, would had a couple things: a commitment that they fundamentally believe public transit is critical for America, not only for the environmental issues, but also congestion, and providing every American that can't afford a car, doesn't want a car, the ability to get to work or go where they want to go. So a fundamental belief in public transit. Number two, they believe in the environment and have committed a big amount of money to help that industry transition their fleet, which then, again, depending on the pace of transition, bodes well for our full product line. So Stephen, maybe you can talk a little about the other thing. I'll just caution Noman is the fact that the bill got passed in November, December doesn't mean buses start getting ordered tomorrow. They've got to go through appropriations. The transit agencies have to apply for the funds. They've got to have competitions, which can take 6, 9, 12, 18 months. And so the stuff that we're bidding and winning on now isn't really from that latest announcement. That stuff's the next chapter of our lives. But Stephen, maybe you know the data and the context and the quantums better than I. A little color for Noman and our audience.
Yeah, so I think Paul hit on all the high levels there, and it's been the largest ever investment in U.S. transit. And so just for listeners, generally speaking, in the U.S. environment, 80% of the funding for a new transit bus comes from the federal government, and then 20% is state and local. Previously, there was something called the FAST Act, which was a 5-year act. It was approved in 2015, and then it was in place from 2016 to 2020 and had a 1-year extension to bridge people through the pandemic before they got the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, approved. The IIJA is, like I said, kind of historic investment, 43% increase for transit or, transit funding. And then specific programs have even more funding. A big one that we're excited about is low or no emissions. And that's how a lot of transit agencies fund kind of their initial entry into EVs or now even add-on programs for electric vehicles. That during the FAST Act was a, kind of 100 million, 125 million program. Now it's 1.2 billion per year. So it's a massive, much larger program, much bigger investment there. So we anticipate that will drive a lot of activity. And as Paul mentioned, the Canadian government now has a fundamental program that they didn't have before. and they have major, expectations. They want to replace 4,000 diesel buses with electric buses through their investment, which is multi-year. I think it goes out to 2028, 2029. So as Paul said, we're really excited now. There's long-term funding in place, much larger, reflects the higher cost of an electric vehicle, and also reflects some of the costs associated with infrastructure investment. As Paul did mention, it's generally kind of a 12 to 18 month lead time before you'll see the deliveries, and the real financial impact on our results. But what you should see, as how we expect it to play out, is kind of similar to what you would have seen in 16, 17, 18, where there was a lot of bid activity in 16, 17, and then we had a lot of orders coming through 17, 18. And so our expectation is, as Paul just mentioned, 2022 bid activity will continue. We'll still have orders that we're getting, from stuff that was bid 2021. We'll continue to see that bid activity. And then our volumes and our delivery volumes, assuming, the supply chain will work, we'll get through there, as Paul mentioned, second half into 23, we will continue to see that kind of strong demand for transit, because as Paul mentioned, it's really underpinned by funding and by financing, and it's a record environment that we are in right now coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's good. And so your end product and end markets are a bit different than some of the other OEMs or pure play EVs for that matter. In terms of the incentives or the grants that are being offered in the US, there's a need for your workforce to be unionized. And there's made in US requirements. I'm just trying to get a sense, is your workforce unionized? How is sort of your incentives different than some of the other ones, or is it just exactly the same how it is for some of the OEMs for normal consumers?
Yeah, so let's start on the other side, customer demand side and their requirements. Roughly half of our workforce is unionized. Most of our customers' workforces are unionized, at least in the public transit type dynamic, if not all. 60-something% of our business is the U.S. government funding dynamic, which has Buy America, meaning 70% of the material content must come from U.S. origin, and 100% of the final assembly activities, putting a door on, putting an axle on, putting an engine in, must happen physically in the United States. And so, we over the last number of years have migrated and expanded our U.S. capability to do so. In Canada, we have a couple of provinces, specifically Ontario and Quebec, that have Canadian content rules. And so, we also have the dynamic of trying to figure out how to buy stuff in Canada, or in some cases, complete vehicles in Canada to meet those requirements. So the ability to have one central facility to support both Canada and the United States is not doable, just the nature of those customers. The UK does not today have strict Buy UK or UK final assembly. Having said that, like any government, if you're going to spend taxpayer dollars, there's a huge pressure to have local dynamics associated with it. On the union side, as I said, roughly 50% of our entire workforce is unionized. 70% of our U.S. workforce is unionized. There is no question pressure and policy and initiatives by the U.S. government, specifically the Harris government, to allow for that whole opportunity for unionization. We operate facilities that are unionized. We operate facilities that are not unionized. We are not anti-union. We are pro-employee choice. So if that's what our employees want to do, that's their decision. We're not going to run anti-union campaigns inside our business. Some of our facilities like Anniston, Alabama, or Kentucky and so forth, there has been over the last, let's call it 5 years, efforts to try and organize unions. Our employees so far have not engaged in any serious dialogue, nor do they seem. But if that happens, it happens. It's not something that's going to kill our business. We know how to operate in that kind of environment. The other side that's really critical to us, and it's a nature to some extent of we're using taxpayer dollars. All governments have a very big focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also ESG dynamics, and those are showing up more and more and more inside the RFPs with customers. Commitments around community benefit engagements, commitments around DEI percentages or targets, ESG reporting, and so forth. Look, that's the reality of our world, and it's amplified by the fact that most of our customers use taxpayer dollars. Well aware of it, deeply involved in it. going unionized in one facility that's not unionized is not going to kill our business. We know how to operate that. We want to be an environment where people want to work. And if they want a union, that's their choice.
Okay, that's great. Before I ask the next question, I just want to check with Jordan if there are any questions from the audience.
We have one question from the audience. I think you mentioned, someone mentioned you guys mentioned the customization of the trucks and the buses. How does your supply chain react to, different configurations of buses, given the different weights of the specific requirements of each bus?
Well, look, again, the specifications are not a paragraph that says, I want 50 buses and give me your price. They're thousands of pages. In some cases, they're incredibly detailed of the design they want or the capability they want and so forth. Our supply chain are, for the most part, batch-oriented type suppliers as well. They may be supplying 10 million parts to GM, but they're supplying 2 for 2 buses here and 20 for 20 buses there and so forth. So we get quotes, we get proposals from the various supply chains to try and respond to those RFPs appropriately. And then we place orders. We, in the New Flyer side, and now very quickly in MCI, we don't send POs anymore. They're completely engaged into an supplier type dynamic. So our supply chain is well aware of our master production plan and our expectations going forward, so that they could think about their own capability. There is that dynamic of Buy America and Buy Canada, where especially in today's world, oh boy, I've got a tank that's got a sensor on it. I can't get the resins, or they can't get the sensor. Can I buy it somewhere else? Well, I have to source it in the same place that I intended to source it originally because of Buy America percentages. The other dynamic is there's tooling. There's heavy investments in tooling. I try to set up another supplier for a batch build of certain things is not practical, logical, or economical, because that we got to build and test the tool before they can make the part. So that's part of the reality of the nature of our world, because it is custom and because it is batch oriented. The good news is when we have a New York order for 200 buses versus a Grand Forks, North Dakota for 2 buses, the amortization of the R&D or the engineering supply chain is different. That's the nature of our world.
Okay, yeah, I think that's very good color. And just moving outside of the North American market, let's talk a little bit about the ADL acquisition that you had done in the European market. Are there any opportunities within that business? What can we expect from that business? Any new geographical partnerships through ADL, or what's happening with that part of the business?
So, our timing couldn't have been worse. We bought ADL at the midpoint of 2019. And then, of course, beginning of 2020, the world changed. We bought the thing with effectively all debt. And so, the plan of leveraging up and then deleveraging relatively quickly based on a business plan, that was kind of decimated has, as Norman, put us, looking at, refinancing and redoing our credit and covenant agreements and all those kinds of things. When we bought ADL, 2 things had happened. A, they had done some really cool stuff and impressive stuff on market diversification and growth. We wanted that. We wanted a big growth story outside of our core markets. That we wanted products that we didn't have, so their market leadership in double deck. And the UK had gone through kind of almost a decade of slowdown in replacement of fleets. And so in our minds and in the analysis we did, had a pent up demand. Well, COVID changes everything, and it gets even worse because they're not publicly funded. They're private operators, economic pressures and realities and ridership down and so on and so forth. So first and foremost, the strategy of ADL, sorry, is continue to try and recover the UK market. We still are by far a market leader. I don't know, 60 or 70% of the share. We have a massive market share today with that partnership we had with BYD on the electric. So we're a really early out front leader in that space. There are markets that they have cracked and done well, over the years. Hong Kong continues, Singapore, New Zealand, and probably the biggest market that they penetrated was Europe. They originally went to Switzerland, and then they got a big contract in Berlin, and we're executing on that contract right now. We have designs and plans to go elsewhere, but we're also cautious that spreading ourselves too thin while the business itself has to recover in the UK is a little bit delicate, and that's really where a lot of our focus is to recover in that core UK market, both as that market recovers, but to keep maintaining our share and our profitability in that place. Stephen, I don't know if you had any color to kind of that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul, you nailed everything there. On the recovery and how we bridge back. I think, as you mentioned, really happy with the way things have firmed up in terms of order book, backlog, and bid activity, and government funding, and private market recovery. So yeah, no, I mean, I think you covered all the major topics.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we're coming close to the end of time. So I really want to thank both Stephen and Paul. I really appreciate it. I know it's a very busy time for you. There's a lot of moving puzzles that you have to navigate on a daily basis. So taking out time to speak with us and our investor community, we really appreciate it. Thank you a lot. And for our audience, we will have our next session with Boyd Group Services at 10:40. Once again, Paul and Stephen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nolan. Thanks, everybody.